Please feel welcome, dear listener. As we said last time, the Arctic has taken center stage in our podcast. Feel welcome in our second episode, in which we're going to discuss the geopolitics of the Arctic. We're going to do that with our honored guest, Mark Drinkwater, and my good friend and podcast partner, Rajeev Lachmipersad. We're going to discuss the more hardcore geopolitical interests of the Arctic. And that's the first question I would like to raise to you, Mark. What are the most important hardcore geopolitical interests in the Arctic?
That's a good question. I guess the main interests revolve and have revolved over the last years around territorial claims in the Arctic, with the so-called Arctic 5 countries, which have a direct coastal connection to the Arctic, being involved. So the Arctic 5 have this direct coastal connection to the Arctic Ocean, and they are Canada, Russia, the United States, Denmark through Greenland, and Norway. And of course, they border the Arctic Ocean directly. They have a coastline, and they're obligated by having that coastline, of course, to protect their coastal waters. And so they've been the main countries that have been involved in the Arctic debate. But of course, there's a wider group that have Arctic interests than just those 5, and that's the so-called Arctic 8. The Arctic 8 are the main members of the Arctic Council, and this is comprised of a larger group with 3 additional countries beyond those Arctic 5, which include also Finland, Iceland, and Sweden. And so the Arctic Council, beyond the Arctic 5, is probably the most important body in terms of Arctic governance. Now, in recent years, the Arctic Council has become the main intergovernmental forum for discussing matters of regional interest or Arctic-wide interest. And the permanent members of the Arctic Council are, of course, those 8 countries, but there are a number of observers that are also entitled to sit at the table. Some of those are organizations like the World Meteorological Organization, and there are other countries that are entitled to sit at the table as an observer as well. Now, the purpose of the Arctic Council was to deal with governance issues that face the Arctic states, and also which face the indigenous peoples who are living in that part of the Arctic, which are the Inuit and the Sami peoples of the north. So the Council is effectively helping to further the organization and governance of the region.
What's their most important goal? Avoiding conflict or really settling issues? And
there's a combination of both. If you talk about real tangible needs, there's a responsibility of the Arctic 5, for instance, to offer a search and rescue service. So if you want ships traveling through your coastal waters, an international economic zone, then of course you're obligated to provide a search and rescue function. That means that there are organizational issues like how do you hand off responsibility as vessels transfer from one geographic zone to another? Who's responsible for an oil spill, for example? Who's responsible for picking up crews of ships who put out a distress call, for instance? So there are real practical and tangible needs from an organizational standpoint amongst the countries of the North. And of course, as the Arctic opens up, that implies a number of additional demands vis-a-vis the governance. And that's resulted in services being developed to monitor fishing rights, for instance, for policing geographic zones in the Arctic, for providing icebreaker support to vessels, for instance, and of course, monitoring to prevent illegal activities or illicit activities, if you like, potential terrorist activities against critical infrastructures or industrial objects in the Arctic, which is another thing. Nord Stream is an illustration of the sensitivity of that kind of thing, as are underwater communication cables, which are also responsible for transferring our huge volumes of satellite data, for instance, along optical fiber cables between Spitsbergen and Europe, for example. So
let's take Nord Stream as an example. Of course, it was blown up in different waters than the Arctic. But does the Arctic 8 and the Council play a role after it was blown up? And how does it govern such conflict and tries to settle such disputes?
I'm not familiar with the process, of course, of debate after what happened for Nord Stream. Of course, you could project that type of occurrence elsewhere in the Arctic. There are many sensitive potential targets, of course, that could result in copycat attacks on infrastructure. And of course, part of the challenge of providing policing or support, practical support from a search and rescue perspective, for instance, part of the challenge is the logistical difficulties of operating in, say, the marine environment. I've just been involved in talking to the Navy in Greenland, for instance. The Danish Navy is responsible for policing and providing search and rescue support in the Greenlandic waters, for example. So their domain extends around Baffin Bay on the west coast of Greenland, all the way around the coast of Greenland in the Greenlandic Sea, across to Europe through the Faroe Islands. And so an illustration is this huge expanse of partially ice-covered water in the winter, through which you have to assure the safety of maritime operations and shipping, where to Greenland, of course, there's a huge reliance on shipping of goods, including food and food products, to the population of Greenland. So you can see that there are many dimensions to having to provide those types of security services, not least the demand that poses for satellite data. And that's where we come into the equation, because sustaining an ice service to produce, say, sea ice charts, which facilitate the movement of shipping during the spring and the summer months, where typically the ice might recede. The ice charting is an important element to safe maritime operations, and that's a function that's performed by a number of countries, like the Danish, like the Norwegians, like the Finnish, like the Canadians and the US, and of course the Russians, who have their own ice charting service out of St. Petersburg. Now, these all require satellite data and rely on a constant stream of monitoring information to be able to deliver those services and to assure safe shipping, for instance.
Okay, so there's a lot of interest there in rescue mission, practical support, and also in knowledge sharing. If we go back to what you already called the geopolitical hardcore interest, the territorial water delineations. Can you speak about that a bit more? What are the most important territorial water disputes, and have you certain examples of the past in which you could see this?
Well, I think that the claim to territory have been magnified by various events over the last years, not least one of the events that happened during the International Pole Year. Russia declared or laid claim to part of the continental shelf close to the North Pole by planting a flag on the seafloor. And that was seen as an aggressive move to lay claim to, or territorial claim to part of the Lomonosov Ridge, which extends, of course, from Siberia across the central Arctic to the coast of Greenland. Denmark, Canada, and Russia lay claim to various pieces of this geographic domain. And of course, the actual extent of the continental shelf is and remains a matter of debate. And so science enters into this frame, of course, by enabling geophysical surveys or combinations of a variety of data like gravitational data or subsea coring data and so on to substantiate some of these claims. And so there's been a political forum in which many of these debates have been going on. And of course, the interests are, of course, in relation to future potential for exploiting natural resources in the Arctic, which might be on the seafloor or which might be on the coastal shelf.
So science helps to delineate continental shelves and is providing subsurface data. In that way, science could also help states to exploit natural resources that are available under the surface in the Arctic. Do you have any insight for the listener how many natural resources can be found in the Arctic? Is the potential huge, as it's sometimes mentioned in the press, or is it a little bit less based on your estimation?
No, I think it's reasonable to assume that over 25% of the world's natural resources reside in the Arctic, and this goes for oil. That there are natural resources locked up in frozen clathrates beneath the surface. There are oil resources known that have been untapped largely because of the logistical difficulties of operating in the Arctic. And if you go on land, you only need the ice sheet to recede because of global warming, and Greenland might have a huge area where potential mining of heavy metals or rare earths could sustain a very big economy in Greenland. And so there's both a threat and a benefit to global warming. The threat, of course, is for the impact it has on warming and sea level rise, whilst at the same time, there are states who obviously have a beneficial claim to those natural resources once they become uncovered by global change. So it's an interesting tension that you see there where, in actual fact, the investment in research and expeditions in the north have, to some extent, been fueled by government interests in unlocking those resources. Yeah, a lot of work that's been done in the ice domain, for instance, has been to understand the impact of ice on structures in the Arctic, for instance. Not surprisingly, this relates to oil prospecting and the impact on oil platforms, and those kind of structures have been an active part of polar research for the last few decades.
Yeah,
So
I saw that Russia's also forward that they are building extensive amounts of the heavy nuclear power ships. They are really heavy ships. And one of their jobs is, besides helping other ships going through the Arctic, is mainly helping tankers to go through the oil refineries and such. I also think that that's one of the main reasons they are heavily investing in Arctic marine heavy ships.
And in fact, part of the activities in the last few years have been in relation to reopening many of the Arctic research stations that have been founded during the Cold War have been spun up again by Russia to reinvigorate, if you like, their Arctic programs. At the same time, as well as the infrastructure investments in bases around the circumpolar Arctic, we've seen development of new icebreakers and capacity that will really enable and facilitate safe navigation in Russian waters in the future. Of course, the icebreakers are being developed to help the shipping go through the Northern Sea route. And it's not a surprise that in anticipation of the Arctic opening up, they've been developing that capacity.
Maybe many people thought it was maybe a joke, but when Trump was president, he really wanted to buy Greenland. So it was a joke, or some people thought he was really serious. But was it also maybe because of, I don't know if he was really thinking it through, but because of the minerals that are in the Arctic oceans?
Greenland's been a location of extreme strategic importance, of course, for the US since the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US was responsible for building stations in Greenland for the purposes of monitoring incoming missiles, for instance, and they had listening and watching stations on top of Greenland for that purpose. Of course, these have been used since the Cold War for research stations. So it's interesting, this coexistence between the development of infrastructure for the purposes of the Cold War that have subsequently allowed polar research to flourish. And yet now we see the mobilization of these infrastructures and resourcing for activities in the polar north for probably very different reasons again now today. But it's having an impact on obviously the amount of investment in activities in the polar north. And so when you say another Cold War, it's an interesting phenomenon that's driving activities in the polar north to even new heights.
I think it's inevitable. If you are saying that around 25% of the minerals are in the North Pole, and knowing mankind, I don't think they will just let it there. I think it's like when the new world was discovered, the Americas, that many countries would like to rush in, including China.
Including China, indeed, yes.
So and that'll come. Yeah, that'll come for sure. Let's turn back to one of the regulatory frameworks for how all of this development should take place kind of in a sensible framework, because we should talk about what happened during the International Polar Year was establishment of the so-called Ilulissat Declaration. This was a declaration signed in Greenland between the Arctic Five. Notably, this was designed to provide an implementation framework for law, particularly in respect to law of the sea and rights and obligations of the big five countries in the circumpolar Arctic. And this framework was designed to enable a dialogue, to develop the Arctic under peaceful circumstances and to facilitate protection of the marine environment, including the ice-covered parts of the Arctic. It was to enable freedom of navigation, marine activities, scientific research, special domains for marine protection. And of course, the idea was to facilitate this dialogue and to have a framework in which you could foresee safe activities in the Arctic. Now, that's been the main framework for the geopolitics over the last years. And the question is whether the situation in Ukraine today and the engagement of Russia in that conflict will result in a different kind of a conversation now amongst the Arctic Five. Yeah.
This plays into the discussion of the realist school against the liberalist school. That's a political school that are trying to explain how behavior of states, that are trying to explain the behavior of states. And the realists say that at the end of the day, there's a zero sum. And the liberals say that a win-win situation is possible. Based on what you're telling me now, I'm assessing that in the last few decades, since the end of the Cold War, the liberal school was better at explaining the behavior regarding the Arctics. Nowadays, we see a tendency worldwide that many countries, or the big three, 2 to 3 big blocs worldwide, the West, Russia, and China, view the behavior of states as a zero-sum game. If we look at the Arctics, then there's a drive for the minerals and the natural resources, the raw materials, as you explained before. Do you think that the realists in the Arctics will win at explaining the behavior of states? Or do you think there is some hope for liberal collaboration between all states that are bordering the Arctic? Which school will win? Which geopolitical school?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because, of course, science has always been possible throughout the last decades because at a scientific level, there's an understanding that science and the development of knowledge for the benefit of activities in the Arctic needs to prevail if anybody is to get a grip on how to develop the Arctic in a sustainable manner. So there's this underlying interest of states, of course, to allow the science to flourish. Of course, in the current situation with the tension in Ukraine, there are very few formal contacts with institutions in Russia, which has broken the network of connections, of course, that scientists have been able to maintain over the last decades. And the question is whether that would be rekindled should the conflict end or not, as the case might be. And I'm certain that at least opinions are aligned at scientific level that we need to pursue friendly collaboration in the Arctic for the benefit of knowledge of mankind in general. And
do you think scientific interest will prevail in this discussion?
That's another good question. I would like to hope that would indeed happen. I think that the assembly of knowledge about how to operate safely in the Arctic, how to coexist in the Arctic, how to respect the rights of the indigenous peoples, and how to develop the economies there in a sustainable fashion, knowing that climate change is going to progressively open up the Arctic, is the biggest question that science has to help to address. And of course, as a space agency, we're trying to develop the assembly of this knowledge and understanding for the benefit of a safe and green transition in the Arctic. And I think that's the objective that we would like to facilitate, particularly within the space domain, where we can act as an interlocutor between member states. We can provide information which, with the assembly of the knowledge from our data, can assist in safe political decision-making and to guide decisions of the circum-Arctic member states.
So science can also be beneficial for the peacemaking in the Arctic and keeping more peaceful negotiations between states that are active in the Arctic. It's a facilitator of peace in some way.
I believe so, because it helps to engender connections at a level where the assembly of knowledge is the unifying force, yeah? And it's in everybody's interest to develop scientific knowledge in a peaceful, collective manner. And that's been going on in the last decades. And I would like to believe that we could re-engender that kind of spirit if conflict was to end in Ukraine, yeah.
Okay, then we've spoken about the pursuit of minerals. Do you think what is more important as a driver in the geopolitics of the Arctic? Is that access to natural resources or access to maritime routes and oceans? Especially from a Russian perspective, this could be a discussion in their minds, I can believe.
Yeah, I think that the opening of the sea ice in the Arctic has driven a lot of the debate up until now, because for many decades it was forecasted that the Arctic would be ice-free in the summer months in the 2030s. It's looking increasingly likely that we'll have an ice-free Arctic within the next couple of decades, at which point any seafaring nation could consider sending its ships with supplies through the Northern Sea route. Now, the question is whether they would have to travel through Russian waters or Russian coastal waters aided by icebreakers or not. At least in the last few years, it's been the case that ice conditions are quite unpredictable. And only this last autumn, a lot of ships were stranded in unfavorable ice conditions and rather thick ice conditions along the coast of the Siberian Shelf. And as a consequence, the Russian icebreakers had to go and rescue many of those vessels. So it's not completely predictable at the moment. And as a consequence, many shipping organizations still likely to use the Suez Canal for access between Asia and Europe, for instance. And so making transportation of goods more efficient is probably the biggest driving force for interest in that route through the Arctic. And we talked about China's interests, for instance, in making the transportation of goods to Europe even more efficient. And we've heard how...
And maybe less dependent on the US. If you go through the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Channel,
yes,
you're in American territory. Of course, not literally American territory, but in American Empire territory. If you go through the North Pole,
So we've heard about this concept of the Polar Silk Road.
Yes.
China have keen interest, of course, in helping to develop maritime routes through the Arctic because of the efficiency of transportation of goods to Europe. And the Polar Silk Road concept is underlying, of course, Chinese interest in developing relations with Russia. And so that's in the background, of course, to this whole debate about how the opening of the Arctic would increase trade through the Northern Sea route, for instance.
And do you think this, normally Rajeev is always saying it's trade that unites and politics that divide. And you could say that the driving force of exploration is going to divide countries for natural resources, while trade could unify countries. Do you think if the main driving factor in the geopolitics of the Arctic is going to be the access to oceans, there might be unifying power there, even in the dynamic of geopolitics?
Well, the opening of the Arctic certainly increases the range of countries that can become engaged in Arctic trade and in use of Arctic sea routes. So undoubtedly, many more countries than simply the Arctic 5 today or the Arctic 8 in terms of Arctic Council countries will be ultimately engaged in using the Arctic, be it as a trading route or as a means of accessing resources in conjunction with some of the Arctic states. So yeah, I'm sure the geopolitics of the Arctic will be modified significantly by climate change, and that's probably inevitable. But whether it'll divide or
Unite
is really a question which is difficult to answer at the present time because of the ongoing conflict. And so we'll have to see how the situation evolves.
Okay, very interesting indeed. Will there be a unifying or dividing dynamic in the geopolitics of the Arctic? But just to make it clear for our listeners, to what extent do you think Russia could be a seafaring nation because of the melting Arctic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Arguably, Russia is already a seafaring nation. They're accessing LNG, liquid natural gas, from ports on the Yamal Peninsula. They're processing minerals like at the nickel processing plants. And there are shipping along the Siberian Shelf linking ports together today. And so they already see the importance of this maritime artery. And at the same time, the Russians have been developing an icebreaker fleet to assist other vessels in the Arctic from the countries that want to use the Northern Sea route. And so clearly they've been developing their capacity in this area, not least also in the military domain. Meanwhile, Russia's conducting war games in a 150,000 kilometer square area in the Barents Sea off the coast of Norway. This involves Russia's northern fleet with approximately 15 warships and submarines supported by the Air Force and coastal air defense units. So the Arctic is a hive of activity in Russia at the moment.
Is Russia currently the strongest military power in the Arctic?
No, that's a
We
good
also
question.
talked back in Eastern Europe.
I'm not party to many of the things that are going on in the defense sector, and public space is certainly not wandering into that terrain very often. And so, yeah, there are a number of Arctic states that have clear mobilization of military assets in the Arctic. And I've seen this tendency in many of the surrounding Arctic countries, but which country has the most power is a difficult question to answer.
I can imagine. Is this militarization? Should we fear this militarization as European Union, European citizens?
Not as long as there's a healthy dialogue, I think, amongst the Arctic states, which there are forums for having these dialogues, although I don't know the extent to which Russia withdrawn from the conversation in, say, the Arctic Council over the last years. The most important thing for the future is to maintain these fora for a healthy dialogue, to avoid geopolitical tensions from rising to the point where we approach any kind of conflict in the Arctic. At the moment, I would say that conflict's not likely, but of course, we have to maintain that dialogue.
Okay, we have to maintain the dialogue to de-escalate at moments of escalation, which can be hard in the future. But until now, we are able of maintaining the delicate balance. And that brings us to the next subject. You addressed it already quite extensively, but to make it more clearer for our listeners, how will the geopolitical landscape look like in the future, according to you, or what different scenarios are there?
It'll evolve dramatically. I have no doubt about that because of the opening of the Arctic due to climate change. And we monitor vessel traffic, for instance, from satellites. We can look at the growth in the volume of traffic in the Arctic. We can see where ships are coming from, going to, using VHF tracking from vessels, which allows us to monitor the sea routes. At the same time, we know the limitations from ice conditions from our satellite imagery, so we know where ships can and can't go from a logistical standpoint. That demonstrates that the number of actors in the Arctic is really increasing. The increased interest obviously is driving states' interest in the energy sector and in export sector. States that are far from the Arctic are also setting up strategies for exploiting the Northern Sea route. And so there'll be increased attention to their own maritime operations in the Arctic. Of course, the underlying reason for this increased interest in the Arctic is to be able to access resources as well. So resource extraction will become easier as ice-covered areas melt and as the permafrost degrades. That'll make it easier maybe to extract minerals in the future. Rising temperatures globally having an enormous effect on the Arctic, of course, and that'll also magnify interest, if you like, on the trade route between the Pacific and European sector as well as North America. As the sea ice withdraws in the summer months, you could see, rather than ships going around the Northeast Passage, you could even envisage ships traveling directly across the central Arctic. And of course, that raises questions about safety, potential oil spills, and who's responsible for search and rescue in one of the remotest regions of the Arctic Ocean. So, yeah, it raises questions as well about how the geopolitical landscape and the fora will evolve, given the number of players will be increasing in the Arctic in the future.
Yes.
China, we talked about. Meanwhile, China's been expressing strong intent to exploit the Northern Sea route, and they're using the Northern Sea route more and more for transportation of goods between China and Europe. So they're playing an important increasing role. And of course, their alliance with Russia is disturbing to a certain degree, and that also heightened attentions about the motives there, of course.
Yeah, very interesting. If you zoom out over the last 2 decades, we have seen that the Middle East was center stage in geopolitics. Now more and more we see a shift towards the Indo-Pacific. Maybe in the decades to come, we see another shift from the Indo-Pacific to the Arctic. Yes.
But I think I don't know if that's really going to happen, because if you see about China's role, they really want the Northern Silk Road to get passage to Europe. But at the same time, because of current geopolitical events, we see that Europe and America want to get more independent of China. There's a less. So I think, how much is it of added value to create another additional sea route to Europe? when the customer, Europe, America's on the other side of the Great Ocean, wants to be less dependent on that. So I don't think,
Valid question. On the other side, to respond to that, it does offer China and Russia a different sea route that's not dominated by the American empire.
Oh, yes, I understand.
And I know for the listeners, we described in other podcasts in Dutch why we think there's such thing as the American empire. We have good arguments for that. So if you don't agree with that, just interpret it as America and the influence sphere worldwide. But then you know. But indeed, it's a valid point. We'll see whether there will be a shift from the Indo-Pacific to the polar region. Would you like to make an estimation, Mark?
But I think it will be an important region in terms of the minerals, especially if it are rare earth minerals. I don't know, lithium or something like that. And then I think many countries want to be involved in that.
And that maybe is more a dividing factor than trade.
Yes, I think.
So then maybe the realist school will win in this equation, in this debate.
Yes.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
No, with climate change, obviously the geopolitical significance of Middle East will wane. But of course, with migration, we'll see far more intense interest focused on the Arctic simply because of the impact of climate change on migration patterns. And so it's inevitable that as people move north, that the focus shifts with latitude. So that's one real consequence of climate change. Yeah.
I have another question on a different subject. It's about, we had it briefly about it, the privatization of space. We see in America, they are further than that. We have the of SpaceX of Elon Musk. We have Blue Origin of Jeff Bezos. And also Virgin Atlantic want to have Virgin Galaxy. You heard about that? And more, because of the war in Ukraine, I now know there's also Maxar Technology, a private company that also has their own satellites. Yeah, just me as a European know American examples, but I don't know any European examples. How is the privatization of space in Europe? And do you think that's a good or not so good thing?
Yeah, at least within the European Union, there's a huge stimulus now being put into the commercial sector to develop the same kind of commercial capacities that exist on the US side. That's leading to considerably more or greater investment in the private sector. Of course, I'm in public space agency, so we see it as a threat as well as something complementary. It's a threat because governments that are investing in commercial space, of course, are not necessarily investing the same amount of money in public space. So we have to coexist with the commercial sector in the space business. But there are many places where we see that the coexistence is beneficial.
Yeah, I see that with NASA. That NASA they get government money, and from the government they do bidding.
Yes. So let's use some tangible examples. The EU is financing this flagship program called Copernicus, where we're developing a number of publicly funded satellites for the benefit of assembling knowledge, not only about the Arctic, but about the globe in general. At the same time, the commercial sector is being financed to develop similar types of information, but which are very complementary to the type of data that we collect. Examples are today in the weather forecasting sector. You would never have imagined that a commercial company might be able to play an interesting, financially sustainable role in the weather prediction sector. But today, we have companies like Spire and Cloudspace building capabilities to provide information that's used in weather forecasting models. And that's one example where commercial space is playing an important role. Another one is that our satellites are largely designed to collect data at the global scale. And one of the things which is most complementary is our commercial satellites to provide very high resolution information at local scale. So we can complement one another by the ESA satellites collecting global scale data, complemented by the commercial sector that provide images at much higher spatial resolution that are of much more local interest for applications and services. So within the frame of Copernicus, we now have coexistence companies that are acquiring commercial data, and through data buys, they're also providing these complementary sources of information alongside our European Space Agency satellite data. So we're learning to coexist with the commercial sector. It's a growing sector in Europe, and it's going to be stimulated more and more by funding from Horizon Europe and through various European Union funding instruments in the future.
And I think there are different types of privatization or even collaboration in space. There is collaboration based on knowledge gathering and data gathering, and of course, access to space. And both are being commercialized. How do you assess both types of privatization of space?
Well, the first one, which I would call the application sector, has been driving growth of commercial sector here in Europe, because that can be stimulated through our own data, through ESA collected data. So an idea can be spawned by the existence of a certain type of data. And then companies find a market niche for developing a service or an application of those data, which can enable them to develop a business. Now,
can entrepreneurs also contact ESA to collaborate?
Yes. In fact, we have a business innovation center that allows new company endeavors to explore the possibility of developing a sustainable business using space-based data. And this is something that we try to stimulate through our BIC, our Business Incubation Center, which is aligned with ESA close to Noordwijk and on the space park. And that provides a small environment in which new companies can investigate and elaborate on their business idea. And we can help them to mature the idea for it to become a commercial success.
So also the ordinary entrepreneur can collaborate with ESA, of course, in specific domains, not for everything. But then the second type.
So the second part was related to access to space.
Tourism.
Well, there's different types. First of all, if you have your commercial satellite, you need to launch it. And today there are no commercial small launchers inside Europe. And so there's a whole new sector being stimulated in Europe at the moment, which is the small launcher segment, which would allow you as a commercial company to launch your small satellite, which would be a microsatellite, washing machine sized or smaller CubeSats, as we call them. These are the commercial basis for many companies to investigate space applications. But at the moment, they're launched through rideshare agreements with ourselves, ESA, or with commercial companies like SpaceX or other launch providers around the world. That commercial sector can therefore benefit from Europe developing its own commercial avenues for small sat launches. And that's a sector that's going to grow over the next years. There are a number of endeavors at the moment. Unfortunately, one of the Virgin endeavors has gone bust after a failed launch recently from an aircraft slung launch vehicle. But there are other launch facilities being developed in Scotland, for instance, or in Norway, where we might foresee in the future much greater opportunities for commercial companies to launch their satellites.
Is it something you think we should support the privatization of space?
Yes. I think it's inevitable that the objective of many governments is to stimulate the commercial sector. That's not just a big aerospace industry. It's an entire ecosystem which survives on everything from ICT, computer technology, data delivery mechanisms, through all the way through the development of products and services based upon data and information provided by satellites. And so the interest is in developing allowing the entire ecosystem to flourish, and not just to focus on one aspect, which might be the development of technology for the satellites themselves. And so I think the interest in Europe is to allow that entire ecosystem to flourish. And we have different players who've got different competencies and different interests throughout the ESA member states and throughout the European Union. And Europe has a huge competence in this arena, and that's been proven over the last decades. And we have a fantastic foundation on which to allow commercial space to flourish in Europe, yes.
So the privatization is absolutely inevitable, and we have an ecosystem that you would like to see flourishing. And of course, many Europeans do agree with it. And ESA can help in this regard. And it's providing a lot of data to the world, not only to European citizens and companies. Do you support the idea of open access data and science, something the ESA is really strong at, but other parts of the world like Russia and China tend to have a different opinion and a different access to those data they collect?
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect to the way science progresses globally. Of course, we've got a free and open data access policy for years now, which has allowed the use of European Space Agency data products to flourish. And That was proven by similar such actions taken in the US many years ago by the USGS, the Geological Survey, who was responsible for distributing Landsat data, which is one of the types of imaging data acquired by satellites, which is known very well globally now. It was through the public release of open and free release of those data that we saw the space sector flourish. And of course, all of these downstream applications and services flourished because the publicly funded satellite data was open to the world. We've seen the same growth in the remote sensing and space sector in Europe. And with our own policy to release the data freely and openly, we've seen the same trajectory in terms of the use and the applications of our data. So it's a natural progression, really, for publicly funded space agencies to go along this trajectory. That's helping to build, of course, the industry throughout Europe, and it's helping to build the competencies in using the data. When we compare ourselves, of course, to the countries that you mentioned, China and China and India, where their space industry is a little bit more reluctant maybe to follow the same trajectory right now, we, of course, try to encourage them to open up a little bit more their assets to the rest of the world. And that's a process that we're trying to stimulate through coordinating bodies for space agencies around the world.
Why are they reluctant?
Well, it's a combination of strategic assets. And there was always a feeling in the past maybe that after their public funding had been responsible for those developments, that they should profit first, maybe from whatever advances come as a direct consequence of the investment. Later, maybe when they feel a little bit more competent in that domain, they'll open up the avenues to access the products a little bit more. But at the moment, we have to stimulate them to play, I guess, in an arena where through peer pressure, they have access to the other data from space agencies. And we can only win globally from collective access to one another's data. The knowledge will grow as a consequence of that. And as we've said, the space can be a unifying force between member states by enabling collectively improvement in scientific knowledge. And when we think about some of the biggest global challenges today, water resource availability, greenhouse gas emissions, controlling the impact of global change on forest fires, extreme events, and so on and so forth, I think there's a collective global responsibility. What comes with that global responsibility, of course, is sharing of data and knowledge.
So to face, as humanity, the biggest challenges of this time, we need knowledge sharing worldwide and access to each other's data. I completely and fully understand that. And maybe we are a little bit more ahead in the cycle of sharing data than other parts of the world. But to ask one, to place advocate of the devil, do you think that China, India, maybe also Russia can take advantage of our open access to the data?
Of course they can. And that's one of the negative aspects, possibly, of the fact that we do make it free and openly available. On the other hand, we want to continue to provide an open playing field, I think, for the type of data that we collect, and these fair principles that should apply in science and research in general should govern the environment in which we share that data. And that's the principle, I think, that everybody can appreciate and understand and subscribe to. Whether they gain strategic advantage from accessing our data is a good question. Everybody has equal access to those data today. So arguably, they don't gain a specific advantage from consuming vast quantities of our data. We know that China's one of the biggest users of Copernicus data, for instance, collected by the European Union funded satellites. And whilst that might be worrying, it demonstrates an avid community in terms of consumption of our data in Asia in general. And that's also a good sign about the value of our space assets in Europe. So we definitely have valuable technology in space here in Europe, and that's proving valuable the world over. But if we look at some of the challenges we talked about, particularly for, say, emissions monitoring, let's go back to CO2, because we started out with CO2, global warming, and ice melt. If we think about monitoring emissions and reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases, China has to take responsibility for this, as does India, as do Europe, do North America and South America. And we have to have a collective endeavor to monitoring so that we trust one another's data, first and foremost, because it needs to be used in a regulatory fashion. And so what we don't need is China pointing the finger at Europe, or the US pointing the finger at China, or Europe pointing the finger at India, because we don't trust one another's data. I think by sharing data and understanding the quality of one another's data, we can help understand and appreciate how satellite data, for instance, can be used in a regulatory framework for emissions monitoring. So when we talk about CO2 and methane monitoring in the Paris Agreement, for example, we need China and India on board. We need a fruitful, open conversation to flourish about use of one another's data, because that's the framework in which we'll succeed in working together to reduce emissions.
So science can unify the world to face the biggest challenges we have as humanity. I think that's a very nice way of looking at it. And also, I think it holds a lot of truth. And in that regard, do you think there's something the European Union or maybe ESA can do better? Or maybe also the Netherlands? As you might have heard, listener, Rajeev and I are from the Netherlands. We did our best to make it as accessible for you as possible. Please forgive us if we haven't been able to achieve that. But can we do something better?
Well,
Are you free riders in the Netherlands?
we have no, and I don't single out any one of our member states. The Netherlands is one of our funding member states and very important for the ESTEC facility here in Noordwijk in the Netherlands. But of course, finance for and public finance of space in Europe is one of the most important features that allows us to pursue our endeavor. And in that respect, we have a space summit later this year where we ask member states in Europe to come together and to reassess the value of space and spin-offs from space, but also the benefit of investment in space in general, because we'd like to accelerate investments in space so that Europe can play a bigger role in the space sector. And in that respect, not only the ESA member states, but the EU has a valuable role to play. And if we turn attention to the Arctic, the EU has got a valuable role to play, not only in boosting the space economy in Europe, but also through its Arctic policy. That's something we haven't spoken about, but let's touch on the EU Arctic policy for a moment, because if we come back to art and sustainable development, the EU has established a framework from the EU's updated Arctic policy that was published in October 2021. And the goal there is to preserve the Arctic as an area of peaceful cooperation. The EU wants to demonstrate that it's got valuable assets in support of understanding climate change in the Arctic, and in terms of using those assets to support sustainable development in the future. And so the EU has a very important role to play. They also finance a considerable amount of our satellite projects through the Copernicus system. And there we're developing satellites specifically for monitoring the Arctic in the future, for instance. So investment in space is an area where our ESA member states and the EU can help. Of course, it comes down to finances in the end. We have big ambition, as you will have gathered. And the idea is to continue to grow the space sector in Europe in the future in general.
And in order to achieve that, more funding would be
Great.
essential.
Yes, we think about space for a green future. We think about decarbonizing European economy and how space can help take rational policy decisions. And so space is the essential ingredient to helping economies throughout Europe to develop sustainably under those circumstances in the future. And so, yes, more funding is always beneficial, of course, for continuing to develop our competencies and our technological capabilities. And space has been proven to help boost economies throughout Europe, and there are economic surveys that demonstrate the value of investment in space. And so I hope member states continue to value ESA, and we'll look forward to more fantastic developments in the future, I'm sure.
Yes, and I also think like the space is enormous, like there's no boundaries. I think the technologies that came out of the space technology are also boundless. So it's, of course, you need to invest in it. On the short term, you won't get that much. But in the long term, the technology, the wisdom, name it, I think that's endless.
Yeah,
Almost.
that's been proven.
Yeah.
I like to think over the years, and when we reflect back on the amount of impact that space has on our daily lives, I think it's proven to have brought beneficial technologies. And in the long run, we're going beyond just the technological aspect of things. We want space to have a beneficial impact on everybody's daily lives. And that's how important space has become to us. So I hope that our member states will continue to value what we do, and that the commercial drive, of course, doesn't undermine the role that I think public funded space has to play in the future in Europe in general, as a unifying theme across all of our member states. Yeah.
Science can unify. In order to face all challenges we have as humanity, we need space science. And we made some quick calculations that the ESA is getting around 600 million euros a year. Correct, right? Something in that
order of magnitude, although we have a variety of investments that come to ESA. We have also joint programs, for instance, with the European Union for Copernicus. And so there are sources of funding from EU framework funding, for instance, for Copernicus, which complement what our member states are funding. And we have a variety of programs which together amount to much more than that. But it's the collective endeavor, of course, across our member states. And if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, we have 26 member states who valuing what we do in observation of Earth inside ESA, which is only a small part of the overall programs that we have. Of course, we have telecommunications, we have navigation programs, we have space science programs, we have manned space flight. And so Earth observation is clearly only one piece of the overall jigsaw puzzle for space in Europe in general.
Okay, so there's a budget there. Just to remind our listeners that FC Barcelona, a football club in Spain, is having a yearly budget of around 600 to 800 million euros. So just try to imagine what's more important, the football club in the northeast of Spain or ESA. And then to all policymakers, of whom I know there are many from the Netherlands who are our listeners, please increase the budget for the Netherlands and maybe also elsewhere in Europe. The humanity needs it, and we can benefit from it ourselves as well. And also the economic growth will expand in the years to come. That brings us to the end of our podcast. Mark Drinkwater, thank you very much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Rajeev, do you have something concluding remarks?
No, the only concluding remark is, I was wondering if it's possible to go to space as a tourist. Won't you go there?
I would, of course, take the opportunity today. Maybe the risks of the past have been reduced today. Space is a safer place, but that's opening up, as we've seen, the avenue for space tourism in the future. So who knows?
Let's hope that the next podcast we will record it somewhere in space.
Yes.
I think that's a very excellent last question. Thank you very much, Rajeev.